Secretary Moniz, thank you so much for hosting this first panel. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Margot, and thanks to Ardian for holding this meeting on the role of governments and investors in advancing hydrogen as part of the energy transition to a low-carbon world. You know, we are at the midpoint between the 1992 Rio Earth Summit and the 2050 midpoint of the 21st century. 1992 was the year that many countries, including the United States, signed on to meeting the climate challenge. 2050 is the year that has elicited pledges of net zero for many countries and companies. But the first 29 years have led, frankly, to little progress when judged against the magnitude of the challenge. If I take my own country, we have reduced greenhouse gas emissions by about 10% since 2005, roughly canceling the increase from 1992 to 2005. This is unfortunately reflective of the limited progress we have made collectively in addressing the challenge that was somewhat understood decades ago, but that has come into much sharper focus with the progress of science and the realities of extreme weather as an expected consequence of global warming. The issue now really is the next 29 years, and indeed the next decade as a stepping stone to mid-century. Obviously, a dramatic change is needed for de-risking investment. Paris and COP16 was critical. COP15, was critical for the tangible acknowledgement of responsibility by all nations. Now, Glasgow in COP21 must codify ambition as in net zero and assistance to developing countries. First, it's clear that decarbonizing electricity is the lead horse. This is already the case. In the United States, for example, the electricity sector has decarbonized by 27% since 2005 versus the 10% economy-wide reduction. Indeed, electricity accounts for the majority of that 10%, mainly by displacing coal with natural gas and renewables, solar and wind. France has always had a low-carbon electricity footprint because of its dependence on nuclear energy. For some other regions, the same is true because of hydroelectric power. The IEA has highlighted the importance of CCS. The costs of solar and wind have come down dramatically, opening up the possibility of low-carbon electricity sectors in many other places, although the challenges of expensive electricity storage become more and more severe as the variable sources gain major market shares. Nevertheless, the trajectory towards low-carbon electricity is clear, with multiple options, including renewables, nuclear, and CCUS on coal and natural gas power plants. Reaching net zero electricity before 2050 is a real possibility and an important goal. But zero carbon electricity, realistically, will not be enough for economy-wide net zero. Other sectors, transportation, industry, buildings, agriculture, waste management, are much more difficult to decarbonize. Electrification of these sectors obviously can take advantage of decarbonized electricity supply. We see this happening with the rapid penetration of light-duty electric vehicles as the cost of lithium batteries falls and governments provide financial incentives. However, at the root of this phenomenon is also the reality that EVs are high performance and appeal to many drivers on that basis. But the reality is that many parts of these hard to decarbonize sectors are unlikely to be practically and economically electrified. Low carbon electricity will need to be complemented by a fuel and by negative carbon technologies. Oil and natural gas largely provide the fuels today for all modes of transportation, industrial processes, agriculture, and other energy-intensive activities. Their direct use across multiple energy end-use sectors generates the greenhouse gas emissions that constitute catastrophic risk to our economy, security, environment, and way of life. All of the alternative, sustainable, scalable fuels today are challenged by cost. Innovation is needed to reduce these costs, especially in terms of what the end consumer sees as energy prices versus more abstract notions of direct and indirect, for example, health costs. I believe it is fair to say, turning to today's subject, that hydrogen is emerging as the most likely candidate for this fuel, in quotation marks, as a complement to electricity, recognizing that technically hydrogen is an energy carrier in many instances, just like electricity. Hydrogen can be positioned as the, quotes, new natural gas, serving multiple sectors flexibly while eliminating major greenhouse gas emissions. It can be combusted cleanly and replace carbon-emitting industrial processes, such as in steel making, assuming, of course, that it can be produced and distributed at large scale without CO2 emissions, green, blue, pink, and other spectra of hydrogen production. It can also play the role of large-scale energy storage, including the seasonal storage that may be enabling for solar energy distant from the equator. The promise of hydrogen as a critical enabler of the low-carbon energy transition must now be met by the realities of building a major global industry at scale with a combination of government policy and incentives, support, and private sector capital. This is the focus of this roundtable. How is the hydrogen vision accelerated into market formation in this decade? There are many real-world complicated issues. How will global markets form? What will be the distribution needed? What is the role of national regulation of hydrogen as an energy commodity? How do national plans integrate with a global market, basically in the very early stages of development? How will innovation that lowers costs affect the scope, scale, and pace of hydrogen market development? What will be the physical modes of hydrogen trade and utilization? Hydrogen versus chemically bonded hydrogen, like ammonia? How will sufficient certainty be provided to investors? There are many more questions, but let's get into it with our distinguished panel. And first, in fact, introduce Fatih Birol, the Director General of the International Energy Agency, who will help frame the question further. Could we turn to Fatih Birol, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, it's a pleasure for me to join you for this Ardian roundtable. Please do accept my apologies for not being with you live. It was my plan, but I was very much looking forward to join you. But in the last minute, I was called for a series of meetings in Brussels. I had to go there. My best regards to Secretary Moniz and my colleague, Mr. Noé van Hulst. The topics you are discussing today are now at the heart of the work we have at the IPHE. We have all seen over the last year a proliferation of net zero pledges from different countries and companies. The level of commitment to fight climate change has never been higher. But if we take a step back, the picture becomes less encouraging. There is a huge gap, widening gap between the rhetoric and the reality. This year, we have a record number of new climate commitments, but also this year, we have a record increase of global CO2 emissions, the second largest in the history. At the IPHE, we have carried out a major report on net zero by 2050. And we discuss how the world can reach a net zero, reaching those commitments. It is a race against time, not against each other. No one wins this race unless everybody finishes the race. And here we have two major broad of homeworks. One, to make the most out of the technologies we have today in the market. And the second, we have to make use of technologies which are under development and bring it to the markets, especially around 2030 and beyond. In this context, hydrogen will be critical, but we need to get it out of the starting blocks immediately. Fortunately, there are many good signs. Many governments are developing their hydrogen strategies as part of the long-term climate and energy ambitions. Some governments have set ambitious targets, such as the EU, that aims at 40 gigawatts of electrolyzer to be installed by 2030. There is a big push on hydrogen innovation coming from the United States. The Hydrogen Energy Earthshot initiative aims to cut the cost of clean hydrogen by 80% by 2030. And many countries are also making huge efforts, putting financial commitments. France, Germany, Japan, and others. One way to think of hydrogen is that is today where solar and batteries were some 10 years ago. Huge potential, but still expensive. And it is very possible that in 10 years from now, we will think of the policies and strategies that are being adopted today as those that made hydrogen finally make its jump out of the starting blocks and in the spirit tempo in the energy market. Dear colleagues, the global challenge of climate change demands global solutions, as we always say. The international community must significantly up its game to ensure all countries have access to financing they need to move forward with clean energy investment. Given the amounts required, public money cannot be the whole answer. But if it is used well, it can provide the catalyst role for much larger amounts of private capital to support clean energy transitions. Our roadmap is a global call to action, especially for those who have the wealth, resources, and expertise to make a difference, and offers priority actions that can be taken now to move things forward fast. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Fatih, for those words. As you all know, the IEA has been really very, very clear in emphasizing the enormous pace that we need to start on in this decade in order to be able to reach net zero. And with that, I want to turn to our panel. You've already heard some very brief biographies, so I won't repeat them. Let me turn directly first to Mr. Van Hulst. The IPHE that you chair aims to foster international intergovernmental cooperation on hydrogen and fuel cells with more than 20 member countries. This gives you a great overview of how different countries are thinking about their hydrogen market expansion and infrastructure needs. And the vision seems to be somewhat different, frankly, in many cases. Gray, green, blue, pink, and several other colors of hydrogen are in the mix. To what extent will molecular hydrogen be the medium versus chemically bonded hydrogen? Which sectors will be served by hydrogen in different regions of the world? And of course, there are many other questions, all of relevance to investors. So please paint us your picture of the global hydrogen market in 2030 and 2050.
Thank you very much, Secretary Moniz. I think it's a great sign that the investment community is basically ready to move. So what is needed now in order for the private investors also to really come on board with this great momentum in hydrogen? I think that's what are one of the key questions. So in terms of government policies, I see, like others have already emphasized in the earlier discussion, there's a big need for, on the one hand, on the supply side, have temporary support schemes to help scale up fast the investment in clean hydrogen. And indeed, on the demand side, we definitely need very strong signals from government that create visible demand in those sectors that already have been stressed by many others, particularly the hard to decarbonize sectors: industry, heavy-duty transportation, seasonal storage, and some others. But those three are the main focus areas of what we see as described in many of the hydrogen strategies around the world. And last but not least, it's not only the supply and the demand, it's also the infrastructure. Indeed, like the CEO of Total rightly emphasized, we also need to develop timely way the infrastructure and the storage in order to transport the hydrogen from demand centers to supply. Now, let me briefly touch on a couple of key regions, because that's where, of course, we will see most of the action in the next couple of years. And I'm very much focused, Mr. Chairman, on the next 10 to 15 years, because I believe if we do not succeed in the first successful scaling up in the next 10 to 15 years, as has the IEA already pointed out in their roadmap 2050, if we do not succeed that, then we do not have a chance to reach those wonderful levels in 2050. So that's why I'm very much focused on the 10 to 15 years. So in Europe, I think we do see a very strong push from the Commission in the hydrogen strategy to develop the demand, supply, and the infrastructure. So some good news is that you, for instance, see a big push to repurpose gas pipelines for transportation of hydrogen. And that could happen, according to a plan of the infrastructure companies, in the next 10 to 15 years. We would be able to transport hydrogen produced either from renewable energy, but also from blue hydrogen, so with carbon capture and storage from gas, from demand centers to from supply, to the demand centers across Europe, from east to west, from north to south. And that's very critical. We do need to make that happen. What we also need to make happen is, of course, the first scaling up that we see happening in the ports area. So industrial ports, that's where a lot of the industry is concentrated and where a lot of logistical chains happen, ships coming in, but also trucks. Those are the first areas where the scaling up can happen in the next 5 to 10 years. And then coupled with the big push on the infrastructure, that can set up Europe for a very strong penetration of clean hydrogen in the next 15 years. Now, across the world, I think the US will probably soon follow in this vein as well, with the new initiatives from the Biden administration. In Asia, we definitely see Japan and Korea moving. Japan has, of course, set up very important projects with Australia, with Brunei, with also the Middle East already, where they're starting to import clean hydrogen for industry and also for power generation. And those are the first global value chains that need a lot of support. We need to facilitate that in order to have the first global hydrogen trade happening. And we see other countries also jumping on that bandwagon, like Chile, and other countries as well. Canada possibly is also eyeballing this kind of global trade in hydrogen. And I think that is very critical. And we need to support that strongly with the international community. But I'm sure we will come back to that. Let me not be too long at this very moment in time, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. And we will indeed return notice to some of those questions. Let me turn now to Mr. Bonhoff. You're a member of the German government, and Germany is certainly one of the countries advocating acceleration of hydrogen's role in the energy economy. What is the vision? What steps is the government taking to accelerate hydrogen market formation, tax incentives, subsidies? As with NOAA, how is the German government seeing the multi-sectoral uses of hydrogen? What about setting standards and regulations, not just safety standards, but also those that define energy commodity markets, as is the case for natural gas? How is the private sector engaged in setting the policies, regulations, and standards? This is critically important for private investment to be unleashed at scale and at the pace that Fatih Birol indicated. Basically, what is the integrated national plan for accelerating a hydrogen plus clean electricity economy? A lot of questions. Please, Dr. Bonhoff.
Yes, Secretary Moniz, thank you very much for that broad set of questions indeed. And obviously, I would very much like to thank Ardian for setting up this meeting to have exactly that discussion. How can the various actors join forces in order to make hydrogen a reality in the energy system, but also to decarbonize industry processes? And maybe I'd start a little broader, looking at the question, why hydrogen? I mean, we have heard a lot already, but let me put it in a more political and in a more societal way. The reality of climate change has become aware to a broader public. And the role that hydrogen can play in that context, I believe, becomes more and more obvious and visible. And I think it was Fatih Birol about 2 years ago who said, well, what has changed? Renewable energy has become so cheap that we will have to find a way for a global renewable energy trading scheme. And you trade energy in forms of molecules and not in forms in terms of electrons. So this is why, coming from this broader picture, hydrogen, trading of green hydrogen will become a commodity. I'm very convinced of that specific point. Now, when it comes to implementing things, we obviously had a very critical year last year with the pandemic, but this led to the fact that a lot of public money was made available in order to take advantage of the very specific situation and to define stimulus packages in a way to really change the system that we live in order this transformation in the energy system, and mobility is part of the energy system for that matter. So a lot of public money has become available to move things forward. And I think this needs to be stressed over and over again. Technology is available. Yes, we need to scale. Yes, we need to make sure that commercialization takes place. And then in that context, it's not only about climate change, it is also about hydrogen technologies as an investment opportunity for one, but also from a government point of view, a way to provide jobs to your industry in this technology field. Looking at Germany specific, obviously, with our automotive industry, that transition to electrified drivetrains with batteries and fuel cells will need to be supported by making sure that the supply industry goes through this transformation process and is capable of, in the end, providing the technology. So you have to look at hydrogen in that integrated way, and that was specifically what we tried to do with our national hydrogen strategy that we came out with pretty much a year ago, where we looked at demand and supply. So the whole value chain producing hydrogen, and our clear target in our German strategy is to support production of green hydrogen. And then on the demand side, it is not only about individual demand, it is about the sum of the individual applications. It is about decarbonizing industry. It is about taking advantage of hydrogen in the transportation system. And yes, when we talk about hydrogen in the transportation system, we have that discussion on, well, cannot batteries do the job? Why do we need fuel cell drivetrains? No, the complexity of mobility requires the whole set of technologies. And again, we will import green molecules, so we should take advantage of them in the most efficient way, also in fuel cell drivetrains, in all modes of transportation. So the German strategy really looked at the domestic opportunities, and we defined a target of 5 gigawatt of electrolyzer capacity by 2030 based on renewable energies. But the overall energy demand is much higher than that, so we will need to import hydrogen. We are looking at European initiatives. We're starting these important projects of common European interest with an interesting funding scheme that we have, but we need to look at importing hydrogen, green hydrogen molecules from a global market. And in that context, it's not only about funding, it is about setting the right regulatory framework. It is about quotas, possibly, as we talk about it in sustainable aviation fuels, but it is also really a need for a legal definition of clean hydrogen. So in all that colors that we're discussing, we need to be very clear what's the product that in the end is being provided to the markets, providing, serving the sustainability goals that we all have. And maybe I'll leave it with that for now. I'm happy to talk more about funding and regulatory framework, but that shows a little bit the complexity and the motivation of the German government to heavily invest into this technology.
Well, thank you. And you raised some interesting points. One I would observe your point about the publics being more aware of climate is something that pertains as well to the United States, where we've obviously had some political turbulence on these issues. But I would just note that in the 2020 presidential election, for the first time, a major party, the winning candidate's party, clearly perceived climate change as a political winner in the debate, and that is a profound change in our state, in our country. But anyway, there's much there we'll come back to on the regulatory side. But let me turn to Mr. Al-Kaabi. You obviously represent an economy that is diversifying, but remains nevertheless heavily dependent on hydrocarbon production, refining, and export. It therefore seems logical that blue hydrogen would be at the core of your national strategy. So what is the hydrogen integrated plan for a hydrocarbon-based economy in transition, namely the Emirates, with a plan based on significant exports? How do you see market and pricing formation for exported hydrogen? Mr. Al-Kaabi.
Thank you, Secretary Moniz, and I would like to thank also Ardian for organizing this panel. It's a clear demonstration that energy transition is happening, and there is a lot to talk about the future and the outlook of the energy space. Before I start, let me paint a picture by giving a historical perspective about why the UAE is putting efforts in the hydrogen agenda going forward. The UAE is well known, for taking a proactive role in embracing new sources of energy. So if you look at the history of the country, we start exporting hydrocarbon back in 1962. And 1 decade later, in the 70s, we also embarked on or embraced a new energy form with liquefied natural gas. So the first LNG cargoes to be exported from the Middle East was from the UAE. That's a clear demonstration that the UAE, early in its journey, embraced new forms of energy. Then, of course, the country built a very strong economy, with starting in the 80s with the emphasis on diversifying the economy with other industries and trying to rely less on hydrocarbon for future generations. In the year 2006, which is a remarkable achievement we are very proud of, the UAE took a very bold step in the energy transition. We embraced renewable energy. And at that time, we had exactly similar debate like the one we see now with the hydrogen. The UAE took a forward-looking view and decided to be part of the future. So we incorporated a renewable energy company called Masdar. And Masdar nowadays is one of the leading renewable companies globally and regionally. And later also we decided to embrace new forms of energy. That journey started almost 10 years back with building the first nuclear power, I would say, program in the region. So that program started last year, and with a vision to supply 25% of the total power requirement in the UAE from nuclear power. And going forward, that's why it's important to give this historical perspective. Going forward, we strongly believe that all sources of energy will be required to meet the growing energy demand we see now and in the foreseeable future. And I recall one famous graph by Fatih Birol that he showed all the sources of energy will be required in the future. So the conclusion at that time was no, there is no one solution fits all. We need oil, we need natural gas, we need nuclear, we need definitely additional forms of energy like the hydrogen. So now let me double click on Mubadala and what we're doing, and then double click on the hydrogen initiatives in the UAE. So in Mubadala, we, as I mentioned, we embrace this philosophy that all sources of energy will be required. So we are investing in many, investments related to the energy transition. We're taking ESG very seriously, and it's part of our investment philosophy going forward. And when it comes to the hydrogen, we announced big, I would say, agreements earlier this year with the Abu Dhabi Hydrogen Alliance, bringing big players in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, ADNOC and ADQ, and working together to promote the hydrogen going forward. We believe that the hydrogen, be it blue hydrogen or green hydrogen, will see as I would say, strong growth going forward. Patrick Pouyanné earlier mentioned that he sees hydrogen and CO2, for example, providing jet fuel in the future. And to him, I can tell him this, that we're bringing the future here to Abu Dhabi. As we speak, we're forming a consortium to promote the hydrogen as a potential source to fulfill the jet fuel, I would say, demand in the future. That will make airline industry more sustainable. And it's very important for them, I think, to be part of that, ESG compliant and to be a responsible as well airlines in the future. So we're bringing future here in Abu Dhabi, and hopefully in a couple of years, we will hear good news from that program. I will stop there, and I'm sure that we will have more topics to discuss, Secretary Moniz.
Just briefly, so to clarify, are you planning a major blue hydrogen export industry?
No, what we are embarking now is one of our Abu Dhabi entities, of course, is spearheading the blue hydrogen. So we see a clear path for blue hydrogen because of the significant hydrocarbon reserve we have in the country. So that's one path we strongly believe in. The green hydrogen, consistent with the views mentioned during this panel earlier, I think we see a path for green hydrogen in the next 5 to 10 years. What we're doing with the green hydrogen is we're building something called hydrogen demonstrator plant. That demonstrator plant hopefully will become operational in the near future, in the couple of years or 3 years. We are bringing airlines industry, big manufacturers of hydrogen equipments like Siemens and others to help accelerate that demonstration and prove that a hydrogen can play a constructive role in the airline industry.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So our vision, if I summarize it as the UAE, it is very important that we see Abu Dhabi and UAE maintaining its leading position as a reliable and leading energy supplier. And I see a future where we can bring green hydrogen and blue hydrogen to maintain that position going forward.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me turn back to Mr. Van Hulst. Of course, we've heard many times about the speed of the transition being very important, but some questions. First, do you see a lot of distributed production, especially for green hydrogen, while blue hydrogen perhaps evolves as a major supply in a relatively few hubs? What are the key steps that multiple countries need to take in harmony in order to de-risk private investment? Will we see a repetition of the LNG history of long-term bilateral contracts with indexed energy prices? If so, indexed to what? So basically, what's your view of how a global hydrogen market will function in the decadal and mid-century timescales?
Yes, thank you very much, Secretary Moniz. Great questions, difficult questions also. Let me try to make a couple of key points. I think we will see a combination of all of those things, what you said, like decentralized solutions as well as hubs. That will be my best guess. Obviously, green hydrogen very much also appropriate for local solutions. But definitely, I think we will see both the blue and the green hydrogen developing strongly, at least if we indeed will be successful in ramping up the demand. As we said, we need very much strong demand signals. If the demand goes up, we will need so much clean hydrogen supply that we will definitely need all of these options. Particularly in industry, the demand is incredibly big. So in terms of what we need internationally, I think what we need to do is indeed learn the lessons from LNG industry, like you already mentioned. But of course, LNG is a great example in terms of the long-term contracts and import, export, joint ventures, etc. However, it did take half a century. So I think we need to go faster. As Fatih Birol said, it's a race against time, and we need to go faster. So I would like to see clean hydrogen as a kind of a fast-forward movie of LNG. You know, we need to go much, much faster than that by being smarter. And how can we be so much smarter? I think by building global standards from the beginning. Really already now, and this is what we are trying to do a little bit in IPHE, try to find, global standards if we are going to transport the hydrogen. Like Klaus Bonhoff said, my good friend, we need to know, what is the carbon footprint of this particularly hydrogen production coming from Australia or from Chile or from the UAE. So we need to have an international agreement on the methodology. How do we calculate the carbon footprint of hydrogen production? This is what we are trying to develop in IPHE. And then on the basis of that, you can develop a certificates market that can really facilitate global trade. That's one thing. Another thing is we haven't even started looking at, we are just starting as we speak in IPHE, what are actually the trade barriers to clean hydrogen trade? If I import today hydrogen in the port of Rotterdam, which the port of Rotterdam, for instance, in the Netherlands is very much envisaging that they will become a big import hub for clean hydrogen, what kind of barriers, tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers do I actually face? Or how is it in Asia? How is it in the US? We don't know. So we need to, before discovering that we have all these kind of barriers, be kind of ahead of the game, try to identify those possible barriers and already tackle them head on in international agreements and in international trade talks if we happen to have these kind of barriers. So this is the kind of way that I think about these things. If we try to fast forward the global trade, try to be ahead of the game, find those possible barriers and try to tackle them before they even become a real issue. And that's what basically would be my best guess in terms of the trading. What you were talking about, I think the good news is that the first initiatives to develop, for instance, hydrogen exchanges are underway. I know of one initiative in the Netherlands where they are already trying to be, again, ahead of the game and see how we can build a hydrogen exchange where all kinds of hydrogen in terms of the carbon footprint and in terms of green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, well-defined, can be traded and can be indexed indeed, as you already mentioned. I think it's a little bit too early to say how they will be indexed, but obviously this will be important indeed for investors, that you can have reliable long-term contracts with price indexation. So price formation, price discovery, if you will, through exchanges will be an important point going forward. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That really is very, very important, as you say, the price indexation, et cetera, because as Patrick Pouyanné said earlier, since hydrogen is not a primary energy source, how this market develops is not entirely clear to me, at least. And it's good to see that we have experiments going on that can help speed that market formation. To change subjects a little bit, going to Mr. Bonhoff. We've also heard, including going back to Patrick, about the importance of further cost reduction in hydrogen, and that, of course, attaches to the innovation agenda. In 2018, Germany, together with Australia and the EC, took the important step, in my view, of adding renewable and clean hydrogen to the international innovation platform called Mission Innovation, which was established at the Paris COP. The initiative identified as a priority technology development that would accelerate the cost competitiveness of hydrogen in the energy system. It also envisioned strong synergy with 3 other Mission Innovation technology platforms: CCUS, biomass, and sunlight. So if you could, Dr. Bonhoff, bring us up to date on this important initiative and how you and the German government and the European Commission see cost reductions leading to rapid increases in hydrogen's market share of energy consumed. Also, Mission Innovation was expected to increase the opportunity for technology investors. I remember in Paris how Bill Gates represented the sector alongside national leaders. How can the public-private partnership be enhanced? What are Germany and the EC doing to help realize this partnership with private investors?
Yes, thank you very much for this very important topic of international partnership, which I believe is key. It is key in the field of innovation. And I remember when 2018 we started the Mission Innovation on hydrogen, we had a debate. Well, do we need this new partnership? And, we have structures. And the argument really was, in order to make visible what is happening, in order to facilitate exchange among different actors in the field of innovation, but also having clear commercialization targets in mind, I think it was the right way to implement this Mission Innovation on hydrogen. And in the end, thanks to the European Commission, also they came up then with what was called the Hydrogen Valley Platform, which is a nice summary of global initiatives that are ongoing already. Years ago, more in the field of innovation and demonstration, but as we speak, we more and more move towards the markets. And if we talk about public-private partnerships, beyond those on innovation and beyond the more policy-driven ones, like what Noe was talking about, IPHE, and the necessity to really come to a global understanding of defining a carbon footprint of different pathways for hydrogen, looking at the markets, really the main cost reduction that we will see will be in scaling up. And scaling up means to create demand. And let me just, from a German perspective, talk about a public-private partnership that started as early as 2009. And Monsieur Pouyanné from Total Energy mentioned it already, H2 Mobility, where really private companies and government came together to say we have a joint target, which is a network, a hydrogen station network for fuel cell vehicles. And then this public-private initiative turned into a company that would build and operate hydrogen stations. And that's exactly the way we went through in order to get us to where we are today, based on a basic network, scale up, have the operational experience of hydrogen stations and all the bits and pieces around it, including safety, regulation codes and standards, and so forth. So this, I believe, is a good example of what started as a public-private partnership, which now moves more into the commercial space, especially when we talk about expanding the network also for heavy duty and beyond Germany, obviously, to make sure that we get a truly trans-European hydrogen mobility. Another one that I think is worth mentioning is a very new one from our friends and colleagues from our Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy here within the German government. It's called H2 Global. The situation that we have is that we want to produce hydrogen, low carbon, and we know that the cost of producing that hydrogen is too high for the markets that we now can initially supply that hydrogen to. So in between, kind of like a trading platform, H2 Global is set up as a foundation with private investors and private companies being members. And this foundation is tendering the production of hydrogen at a defined cost. And then at the same time, they're saying to the markets, here is the amount of hydrogen that I will have available, and whatever they will get in return on selling that hydrogen will be lower on what they have to pay to produce the hydrogen. And this is offset by public money. So we can use public money to offset this delta cost in the beginning, or, speaking more about the investor scene, to possibly de-risk this scaling up of markets. So this, I think, is a nice example of how public-private partnerships can play a very important role in order to create the markets and to scale up.
To be specific, Patrick Pouyanné, I think, mentioned hydrogen cost today 5 to 10 times that of natural gas. And I think also it's worth reminding people that often the price per kilogram of hydrogen is stated, but of course it's about roughly 8 kilograms for a million BTU in terms of the comparison to gas prices. So do you want to speculate in terms of how, with scaling, how those prices will converge, say, in this decade or not?
Well, I'm not sure I have to speculate a lot, because you can do the math and
Right.
take figures that are available. And IEA did a great job in collecting those global figures, and other initiatives such as the Hydrogen Council has looked at the business cases around hydrogen. Producing hydrogen based on renewable energies today at scale is possible with as low as, say, €2 per kilogram of hydrogen in only certain regions. But those certain regions do exist. And those regions, I'm very sure, will find a way to offer that hydrogen to a global market. And yes, you have to add some transportation cost and these kind of things. But I truly believe that well below 4 or 5 euros per kilogram of hydrogen pretty soon makes it attractive to start with markets like transportation. I mean, transportation would be very competitive at those prices. And then further scale up would lead to prices even below €2 per kilogram, which then is needed for decarbonizing steel industry, chemical industry, and others. So it's, various markets, various price targets, but this is a complete narrative you have to have in mind as an integrated system.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with you. It's what you might call the high value applications in transportation and industry, where I think the cost barriers will come down the fastest. No, thank you. Let me go back to Mr. Kaabi and really drawing upon your role in Mubadala, sorry, and obviously a major investment vehicle and in clean energy. So I'd be curious as to how, from the investor point of view, you see structuring a global hydrogen portfolio for investors. Do you see investment funds supporting what might be called a hydrogen belt and road that extends the hydrogen supply chain across the industrialized and developing economies? And what more do the industrialized country governments need to do to lower investment risk, in your view?
Thank you. To start with, as an institution, we have a deep conviction when it comes to the energy transition. So I mentioned earlier our views on the renewable energy started back in 2005, 2006. So going forward, we maintain similar view and forward-looking view that energy transition is going to play a major role going forward. driven by government policies, decarbonization, climate change, ESG consideration. So we have that strong view of the future. So as a responsible investor, we are committed to invest in this trend going forward. Let me give you a few examples. One of our core values we believe in is partnership, of course. So we've built this institution based on a partnership. And when it comes to the energy transition, we have, as I mentioned earlier, signed major agreements with Abu Dhabi entities to push the hydrogen agenda going forward. We believe that the current energy mix in the UAE is unique. You have nuclear, natural gas, and renewable energy. Renewable energy will take a bigger share going forward. So that provides the UAE with a unique proposition when it comes to making more efficient system and try to utilize and capitalize on hydrogen production going forward. We do have also partnerships and trying to promote these partnerships with key hydrogen players like Siemens. We announced already 2 agreements, one with Mubadala and one with Masdar, and we're progressing on these agreements. So you mentioned road and build or build and road concept. So one example I can share with the audience is we announced also recently a big fund between UK and the UAE. And that fund is a multi-billion-dollar fund. And that fund will focus on 2 key sectors, life sciences and energy transition and clean, or renewable energy. So to start with, Masdar and Mubadala is already well established in UK through our big projects in the wind and in that particular geography. We think there is a room to do more. So that's one example that, yes, we're going to build partnerships with like-minded countries, like-minded businesses, and try to promote the agenda of hydrogen going forward. But it will require also, I think the journey is going to take some time because we need more government incentives, we need more government policies. And I am confident that these will come because of, as I mentioned, the decarbonization and climate change targets. So the ecosystem is about to, I would say, grow, and it can capitalize definitely on existing infrastructure, which makes also hydrogen uniquely positioned in the existing infrastructure of natural gas, be it in Europe, North America, or the Middle East, or Asia. And I can give you an example in the UAE. We have a vision where we see traditional industries like steel or aluminum producers can take advantage of the hydrogen in the future. For example, decarbonizing these industries and making them more or move them from carbon intensive to a low carbon intensive industries. One interesting example I can share also with the audience that earlier this year, the Emirates Global Aluminum, one of the leading aluminum producers globally, announced a green deal with a power supplier here in the UAE. And that qualified them to produce a certain production of what we call solar aluminum. It's unbelievable how many customers around the world were reaching out to us to get access to the solar aluminum. That's a trend. We see it already today. And I'm sure and I'm confident that that trend will accelerate in the future. So we have in the UAE a collective responsibility to ensure that our existing industries are competitive in the energy transition environment and future we see in the near future. So yes, I think there is a way and there is a path, and that path is very clear to us.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists. I wish we had more time, but I think we've painted a picture of some really major challenges, although with a pathway to addressing them in terms of providing regulatory structures, the international infrastructure, et cetera, which I hope is going to be a major conversation on the road to Glasgow in November. so that the kinds of international collaboration to see hydrogen market formation go ahead will be realized. And with that, again, thank you for these insights, and I'm going to turn it back to Margot.
So much, Secretary Moniz, for hosting this conversation, and thank you to all our speakers for taking some of their precious time to be here with us on this summit.